Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hey, welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Pavini Moray, and it's such a pleasure today to introduce you to Clementine Morrigan. Clementine uses they and she pronouns, is a writer living in Montreal. They are the author of several books and zines, including Love Without Emergency, Fucking Magic, Trauma Magic, You Can't Own the Fucking Stars, and The Size of a Bird. And you can find her writing in places like Guts Magazine, Shameless Magazine, Prose and Lore, Somatic, and the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. They are the creator and facilitator of the popular workshop Trauma-Informed Polyamory. She writes about queer sexuality, trauma recovery, developing secure attachment, transformative justice, obliterating shame, anarchist spirituality, and the power of desire. They are passionate about nervous system education. And more than anything, her work is for survivors and people who live with trauma. It's writing about living through really awful, fucked up things and still wanting a big, beautiful, fucked up, powerful life. It's about the desire to live and to love and to feel fucking good, even after everything that has happened. And I highly encourage you to check out more about Clementine and her work through the website, ClementineMorrigan.com, Clementine Morrigan.com. Clementine, welcome to Bespoken Bones.
Thank you for having me.
So good. I'm so glad you're here. And as we were chatting, I was telling you that I have had the pleasure of coming across your writing and spending an afternoon just delighted. And I know that it really hits home with a lot of people, in our communities. So I'm super excited that you're on Bespoken Bones. And, you have a relationship with your ancestors, and just wanting to invite you to talk a little bit about that and, how they show up in your life.
Yeah, so Bespoken Bones is an interesting intersection of topics for me, because trauma and sexuality are two of the things that I do work on the most, like sexuality, love, and relationships, and how that intersects with trauma is basically the focus of my writing in general. And I feel like I talk less about ancestors, but there has been a portion of my work where I have dived into that. I talk about it somewhat in my zine Fucking Magick, in some of the issues, actually. But my zine Trauma Magick, I think, is the zine that I go into the most on the topic. And actually, I feel like I've been doing less work in this area as of recently. So it's interesting to be on this podcast now. But basically, my ancestors are from Ireland, Scotland, and England. And I've done most work with my Irish ancestors, probably because they're the ones, both sides of my family have Irish ancestry. And it just seemed like my Irish ancestors had the most to say to me. And that was coming up a lot. For a while, I was doing a lot of work in that area. I was even trying to learn the Irish language for a bit. But it's difficult to learn a language when you're not around speakers. And now that I live in a place where people speak French, I feel like learning French needs to be more of a priority for me. But it was important for me to do some of that work, and I hope I can pick it up again. So I think that my relationship with my ancestors comes through in some interesting ways, specifically around my spirituality as a witch and a queer person, integrating aspects of Catholicism, which I think could be confusing for some people as to why I would do that. But the reason I do that is because it sits so naturally for me in the relationship that I have with my ancestors, because my ancestors were very much Irish Catholics. And so specifically with the Virgin Mary, when I express my spirituality in that direction, I really feel a resonance with my ancestors. Yeah, so I feel like there's a lot I could say, but that's just a piece of it.
That's great. Yeah, it's a good introduction. I think it leads right into what I want to ask you first, which is about the queer Virgin Mary.
Yeah, so in
you feel like you are up to speaking to that a little bit?
In my zine Trauma Magick, I have a paper about this that's called "All Generations Will Call Me Blessed: Towards a Queer Feminist Marian Devotion." And so, yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I wasn't raised Catholic. Both my parents were raised Catholic and abandoned it. So I was raised without religion, basically, but I feel like I definitely have sort of one generation removed of some of that Catholic baggage. But less than a lot of people, because I didn't actually have the experience of, being raised Catholic. But I have understood myself as a witch for a long time, and I've had my own relationship to spirituality. And once I just came across this sculpture of the Virgin Mary actually in the trash, like in the garbage, and I took her home with me, and like I just felt extremely called to her, and that was the beginning of this relationship. And yeah, it's been an important part of my spiritual practice, and it seems strange to me at first, but I came to realize that it really did make sense because of my ancestors, and because this is sort of like a portal and a gateway into spiritual connection that makes sense to my ancestors, even though I'm engaging with it in a somewhat unusual way. But yeah, in my paper, one of the things that I talk about is there's a distinction between what is called Mariology, which is like sort of the church sanctioned sort of explanation of who Mary is and what she does and how we're supposed to relate to her. And then Marian devotion, which is the lived practice of faith that people have who have a lived relationship with Mary. And that Marian devotion is taken up in all sorts of interesting ways that are not at all necessarily sanctioned by the church or that the church even knows about. And I think the Irish in particular love Mary a lot, and she's really, really important. And that like the personal relationships that people can have with her might totally not fit with what the church is saying Mary is supposed to be, especially just with how prominent she is and like the importance that she takes on in people's lives. So that's sort of the starting point. And then my paper is like an exploration of who Mary is and what she can do and what her power is. And part of what I look at there is her desire, because I think that there is this framing of Mary where it's sort of like a popular culture framing of Mary that this pregnancy just happened to her and that it was something that she didn't really have a say in. But in the Bible, when she goes and talks to her friend Elizabeth after she finds out that she's going to be pregnant, she's actually super stoked about the whole thing. And that's where the line, "All generations will call me blessed," comes from. She goes on this big speech about how she's going to get pregnant. She talks about God is going to cast the mighty from their thrones and lift up the lowly. So she sounds pretty, she sounds like an anarchist to me, to be honest. But there's also like this, yeah. Yeah, she says like that the hungry will be filled up, and the rich will be sent away hungry, and like things like that. So it's very resonant for me. But also I'm just really intrigued by her pleasure and her excitement and her desire in that conversation. And like what would shift about our relationship with Mary if we were able to actually center her desire. And so from there, I started to go into this exploration about imagining what it would be like to invoke a queer Mary. And so actually, I'm not the first person to think about this. And if people are interested, check out my paper on it because I have citations and you can look into some other scholars who have talked about this. But there's one scholar who I quote, whose name I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's in the paper. She says, nothing is beyond the Lord, not even a lesbian conception of Christ. And I think that that's really cool. And so, yeah, I presented this paper in Ireland, actually, at a conference in Galway. And it was a feminist conference. So I knew that it would probably be like pretty well like accepted or not as scandalous because it was a feminist conference. But I did know that like these were Irish women who had, likely been raised Catholic. And I was wondering like how much I was going to scandalize people by saying these things. But afterwards, a lot of women came up to me and thanked me and said that it was actually really powerful because there's like this idea that like if you come into feminism or you come into queerness, that immediately means that you need to like move away from Catholicism, obviously, because there's no space for that in Catholicism. But Catholicism, for many Irish people, is extremely important and holds a lot of meaning and power. So how to like hold both of those things and basically, yeah, this practice of a queer Marian devotion in which we can reimagine who Mary is and what she means to us is like one way of doing that I have found really powerful.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm curious if you want to speak at all to the devotional practices that you observe with Queer Mary.
Yeah, so I mean that's sculpture. I don't know what you call it. It's like her head, but it hangs on the wall. I don't know what the name of that kind of sculpture is, but the one that I found in the garbage years and years ago, I still have that over my altar, as well as like many like figurines and images of her in my room, which is quite hilarious. In fact, on my wall, like I have this big painting of Mary, and it's just like happens to be like right beside where I hang like my harness and like my BDSM gear. So it's like quite a hilarious juxtaposition. And I've definitely had dates come over and be like, and not really understand why it looks like I'm, a Catholic in my room. But for me, it's just, I pray to her a lot. I really have an understanding of Mary as someone who has this unbelievable amount of compassion and space for people's pain, as Our Lady of Mercy and Our Lady of Sorrow. And so she's someone that I feel like I can go to and just totally like give her what is happening for me. And I think as a trauma survivor and as somebody who hasn't had figures in my life, especially in my childhood, who could like offer that kind of unconditional support and care, she's been an incredibly important figure for me. And so, my spirituality in general is very sort of casual and familiar and friendly rather than overtly ritualistic. It's a lot of just talking. There's a particular church in Montreal that is totally devoted to Mary, and it's like incredibly beautiful and has a huge like mural on the ceiling where she's depicted as the Queen of Heaven, and there's murals all over the walls that are showing her in her various states. And sometimes I go there to be with her, but often it's just, as part of my spiritual practice generally, where I have an altar and I create space to pray and to connect. Like she's just a central figure in that work. And I talk to her a lot.
Thank you. I mean, it's just tender to hear about people's practices, and it's special to share this thing with each other about like, how do we actually practice, and how do we, and I especially love the subversive quality of your practice of like reweaving Mary as sexual, Mary as mother, Mary as queer. It's really beautiful. It reminds me, I don't know if you ever saw the film, the John Waters film, Multiple Maniacs. It came out like 1970 or something, but Divine, the drag queen Divine plays Lady Divine, and there's like this scene where she is masturbating in a church using a rosary, right? And it's just like, it was super controversial, of course, right? But yeah, I mean, it's just like the reclamation of queerness within organized religion, right? And then kind of like taking it and like, how do we, because it's like what I heard you say is, this is a portal to connecting with my ancestors, but I have to do it in a way that feels authentic to me, right? I can't do it the way they did it. I have to make it mine somehow.
Yeah. And also I think that like there's sort of like the surface level, like good Catholic, way that people are presenting, but then there's also what people are doing in their real lives, and I absolutely know that, of course, my Irish Catholic ancestors had queer people among them. And like how they were making sense of that for themselves, I don't know, but I don't, I'm queering it, but I don't think that I'm the first person to queer it. I think that it's just really hard to find like specifically what people were doing, because of course we don't have access to that history, especially if it was very queer. But also, like, the Irish in general are known for being like super pagan about their Christianity, and like super I don't know, like, I think that there's a lot of stories about Catholics from other places kind of being like, whoa, when they saw like the ways that the Irish were taking up Catholicism, that was like really, really blended with pre-Christian Irish pagan practices.
For sure. Right. And I know that a piece of this is around the fairy faith. Yeah. I'm just wondering if you want to speak to how does that all weave together?
Yeah. So I also wanted to say, just with Mary, before I move on, that kind of a piece of what I was just saying is that pre-Christianity, like, Ireland was like, they believed in multiple gods and goddesses, and they had, extremely important relationships with goddesses. They were an important part of their faith. So I think that it's interesting that Mary took on such an important role, and also some of the saints, because that actually created a space for them to continue to practice goddess worship, even in a Christian context, under a different name. But yeah, the fairies are very, very interesting. And basically, yeah, that there's another paper in Trauma Magick in which I talk about the fairy faith and my investigations into the fairy faith. So I guess there's a few pieces to this. One is that, the fairies are, I almost think of them as like multidimensional, in the sense that they don't exist as one static thing. They kind of have a multiplicity to their being. And one understanding of the fairies is that they actually are the ancestors, that they are a sort of embodiment or a way that the ancestors continue. But yeah, the fairies are called many things, including the good people. And they are people who live underground in this sort of multidimensional space that is bigger than the external space that encloses it, and in which time runs differently. And basically, they're very almost like morally ambiguous, in the sense that they're incredibly mischievous and kind of do what they want, but you don't want to cross them or disrespect them in any way. So like the fairy faith in Ireland was like a set of practices, and I guess what would be considered superstitions around what you can and can't do, what you should and should not do, in order to make sure that you are in right relationship with the fairies. And what I find really interesting about this is that it's an incredibly place-based and land-based spiritual belief system that actually provided people with a set of rules or guidelines around how to relate to the land. So, for example, there's like certain trees that you're not allowed to cut down, like the hawthorn tree. And it's like, obviously today, living under global capitalism, folk traditions have a really hard time surviving, and they don't exist in the same way that they did in the past. But a lot of these superstitions continue on. And like, even in Ireland today, like there's still like farmers' fields that have like hawthorn bushes growing in the middle of them because they don't want to cut them down. Because that's something that would be incredibly disrespectful to the fairies. And so, yeah, fairies teach people limits about how to relate to land, that you can't just take everything, you can't just go everywhere, because the fairies actually live there and have guidelines for people about what they can and cannot do. And so when I was looking into this in my work around ancestry and trying to understand my ancestors, one thing that really struck me is basically that these are lessons that settlers really, really, really need, because settlers were basically living in a place where we have not been taught how to have right relationship to the land, and we don't have stories and belief systems that are teaching us about that. And so it, obviously contributes to this really intense alienation and the capitalist colonial violence that we see going on right now, which is like massive resource extraction and like a total disrespect for place. And so I was wondering about what the fairies could teach about that, and really came to the understanding that fairies really did offer the Irish people a set of ecological ethics and a way of relating to land responsibly. And I was wondering, and I have been playing with the idea about, would it be possible as someone of the Irish diaspora to have that kind of relationship in a totally different place as a settler on land that is not the land of my ancestors? So it's an interesting question. I did find that early Irish settlements in North America did talk about fairies here. So I think that it is possible. But yeah, basically, I think it's a really important question for settlers to think about, because when we do ancestor work, like we're often going, we're tracing our lineage back to places where we are not anymore. And I think that is really important, but it's also important to be thinking about what is our responsibility to the place where we are, and how can the knowledges of our ancestors help us to be more responsible in the place that we are. And yeah, in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall-Kimmer talks about how settlers often did not bring with them any ceremonies that have to do with place. Like the ceremonies that get brought over are often, about like marking milestones in life, but they don't teach us about how to be responsible to place. And I think that that's something that, settlers deeply need to figure out, because of how disrespectful we can often be to the places that we're in, and also how alienated, because we really don't have a set of knowledges that help us to respectfully engage and to also have limits about how we're engaging.
What it makes me think is that there was some import to the forgetting, right? That for some sake of survival, those land-based rituals had to be forgotten, right? And I'm thinking about how at least when Scotland was colonized by the Romans, that the rituals had to be forgotten. They encoded them into the land, but they had to be forgotten on one level in order to survive. And I think you talked about it as, you didn't mention which goddesses and saints, but I was imagining that you were referencing Bridget and how she became Saint Bridget, right? Yeah, and it's interesting because when I recently moved back to North Carolina after living in California, and I'm of Scottish descent, and very strong fairy faith in Scotland. And when I was contemplating the move back, one of the things that my ancestors reminded me is that the folks who lived on this land, who were the Cherokee, had a relationship with the little people, is what they called them. Right?
Yeah, I've heard about this too in Ontario. Anyway, I have heard that there are Indigenous belief systems around the little people
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
And the what my ancestors suggested was like to remake relationship with this land as well as with my ancestral lands. It was about developing earth-based relationships with the little people here. That somehow that there's like maybe different tribes or groupings or family units of little people the world over, but that there is something that's in common, and that by paying attention, by making offerings, by saying prayers to little people here, it actually was both an honoring of this land that I find myself on, as well as a reconnection with my ancestral homelands, right? And it would be, I think, exactly what you're saying. Like when we are in that intimate connection with the land, it's really hard to do things that disrespect it, right?
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, like it's important to have limits and to sort of have lines drawn around how much a person can take, or, you know, no, you shouldn't build that road there. And I think the fairies really offered people that kind of structure. So yeah, I think that that's really important.
It makes me think about because as we're talking about this, I just noticed how my system is grounding, right? And that connection between right relationship with the land and all of its inhabitants, human and other than human, and our relationship with our body and the earth that is our body, and the earth that is the bodies of our ancestors or the ones who were here before us. Like that there's this connection, this relationship. And I just wonder if you'd speak to that relationship between the body, the nervous system, and the ancestors.
Yeah. So I think for me, in like a very sort of visceral way, as a person who lives with complex PTSD, like I very much carry my ancestors in my nervous system, in the sense that the trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation in my family is like very much alive in my body. And it's funny because I don't know, like I think sometimes talk about ancestors can seem very abstract, or like kind of like the ancestors are out there somewhere. But in my ancestor work, I've always felt like my ancestors are very much in my body. It's like a very immediate relationship that I experience in my body. And yeah, I think that trauma is a very literal, or it can be, depending on the type of trauma, but it can be a very literal experience of our ancestors, of the unresolved trauma that has just continued to be passed on. And so for me, doing trauma work and nervous system work is a really important way for me to not only heal myself, but to offer some healing to my ancestors and to heal the relationship between us. Yeah. So, like, when I'm able to regulate my nervous system to move out of that cycle of trauma, I'm breaking a cycle that has been going on for generations and generations, and offering a new way of being. And I think that for my ancestors, often this kind of work wasn't possible. And so I'm grateful that I'm able to begin to break that cycle, by having a different relationship with my body and my nervous system today.
Yeah, that's super helpful. When I was doing my dissertation research, I asked that question about like, where are your ancestors? And without fail, every person who I spoke with said, "Oh, they're in me, right? I'm made of them." And that was like cross cultural. Yeah, and I think this piece that you're speaking to of the interruption of transgenerational trauma, that like when we create regulation in our body, when we become responsible for our own regulation of not allowing our trauma to just drive where it wants to all the time, right? When we're ethical about how we're holding it in our bodies and what we're doing with it, like it, we're creating our own healing, but we are also interrupting, and we are also like, I just don't think that healing is linear, right? It's like it's cyclical, and it's okay. So like, let's say you have decide to have biological children, or I don't even, maybe you already do, but, or maybe you just have, you have other kinds of descendants of book projects or students, but that healed state is transmitted, right? And with increase, like within each generation, it's increasing, right? So it's like I love this connection of the one way to connect with our ancestors is to become responsible for our own healing. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so much of the work that I do is about trauma and nervous system education. And yeah, I'm like incredibly devoted to other survivors and trying to help in this work. And I think like it is a huge responsibility to take on our healing, and to start to really be like, okay, I want to break this cycle. I also think it's incredibly hard
Oh,
work.
yes.
And it's like, yeah, I think it's really important to also um, like have a lot of compassion for where people are at with that, and how, I don't know, it becomes possible in degrees, and parts of the healing become possible, and then more parts of the healing become possible, and also that co-regulation and the work of like letting other people and also like non-human beings be a part of that process of regulation, and feeling safe in our nervous systems is like a really important piece of it as well. And for trauma survivors, especially people who experience a lot of trauma in our childhoods, like we may never have had co-regulation, you know, offered to us or modeled to us.
Mhm.
And so that is a really important piece of the work as well.
I want to ask a follow-up question about that. Well, first, I think it would be helpful maybe for folks who don't know what co-regulation is to give a quick definition of that, but also this piece around and I don't know if you see this, but what I see often in community is how we replicate our trauma with each other, right? Or how we perpetuate it on each other, or how because we're estranged or marginalized or face different kinds of oppression, like at least everyone who I know, is dealing with some level of that. And yet it can be really hard in outsider communities to co-regulate. And just wondering kind of like what you're seeing, and also what do you see as helpful for that?
Yeah, so I'm a huge proponent of co-regulation, as something that we really need to be talking more about, because I guess, okay, so I guess I should start by saying what I mean by co-regulation. So basically, when we're talking about regulation or co-regulation, what we're talking about is bringing our nervous systems back into a safe and social state. So basically, I tend to use the framework of polyvagal theory to talk about the nervous system. There's different ways of talking about it, but ultimately, like what we're talking about with the nervous system is that there's a part of the nervous system that sort of allows us to feel safe enough to be in relationship with others and to move through the world in the present, feeling relatively safe. And then when we begin to feel threatened and unsafe, we move into dysregulated nervous system states such as fight and flight or freeze. And these states are, survival strategies that are to protect us from danger. And they're important. But for traumatized people, unfortunately, what happens is that we fly into those states all the time. And it's really difficult to actually discern whether or not we're currently in danger or whether we are actually being triggered because of the danger that we were in the past. And so regulation is a practice of developing tools to soothe the nervous system and help to bring you back into a safe and social state. So there's lots of things that we can do to self-regulate, whether that's like grounding exercises, like a lot of the stuff that, we're talking about spiritual practice can be helpful for a lot of people. Sensory things like wrapping yourself in a blanket or taking a hot shower, like there's many different things, and different things work for different people. So we can develop a lot of skills around regulating our own nervous system. And I think that's important that people know that and that we're developing those skills. But what I'm also finding is that the focus on sort of self-care, self-love, self-regulation can often come at an expense of actually talking about the fact that we are social animals who have evolved to deeply need co-regulation from other human beings. And so
I just have to interrupt you for a second because I freaking love that. Oh my gosh. Yes.
This is a huge center of my work. It's extremely important. And where I come into this and enter into this conversation is through polyamory, because basically in polyamory and in like sort of mainstream polyamorous discourse, there's this really intense push for self-regulation. There's this idea that if you're having a really hard time, you need to go and deal with that, and that it's your responsibility and your responsibility alone. And I think that unfortunately is really kind of dishonest, because we are social animals. Like, we really do require, on a physiological level, like connection in order to feel safe. And like, we can't only depend on that, because, we do need to have some capacity to self-regulate, because we won't always be able to get co-regulation. We need a mix. But I actually think that, like extreme alienation, individualism, and neoliberalism have leaked down into a lot of our politics and a lot of our communities. And so we're actually like advising people to act as if we are like completely individual, self-sufficient units, as opposed to animals who have evolved to live in packs, which we are. We really require human relationships to feel safe, and our whole nervous system is literally designed to facilitate that. So when we ignore that part of it, it's like we're doing a huge disservice to ourselves and our actual ability to have deep relationships and to take care of ourselves and each other. And so a lot of the work that I do around this is in the context of polyamory, but it's also relevant, I think, in all types of relationships, which is just that like we really need to move away from this like extreme self-sufficiency model and normalize the practice of co-regulation. And co-regulation is, I think, something that we don't talk about enough, so people don't even fully understand like what that could mean or what it could look like. But like, it can literally be like, there's such a huge range from, the types of co-regulation we will practice, with our deep personal, like intimate relationships that we have with like our partners or our close friends. But we can also practice co-regulation literally like on the street with a random person that we just met. Because like an example is like, if a person is like having a really hard time and they're like panhandling and they're really stressed out, and you respond to them by like brushing past them and refusing to look them in the eye, like that lack of acknowledgement of their humanness and the refusal to make eye contact and the refusal to, it's like saying, I'm taking my nervous system away from you. I'm not going to in any way put my nervous system near you. And as human beings, when we are ignored in distress, it completely increases the distress, right? But if you actually make eye contact with someone, throw them some change, like smile, say something, that's a practice of co-regulation, because you're saying, I'm a human being, you're a human being, I see you, And in small ways, whether it's like, I don't know, helping somebody with the stroller that they're struggling with, or just, little actions of acknowledgement can make a huge difference in how someone's nervous system is responding, and whether they're going to, spiral out into a state of fight and flight and extreme distress, or whether it's going to help them come back up into safe and social.
That makes sense. I have some curiosity coming up around, like, when are you reinforcing, like learned helplessness, or, like maybe like emotional manipulation, if you like, how do you navigate that piece of it? Like I've definitely heard people talk about like, white woman's tears as manipulative, for example. Right. And, yeah, just curious of like what your thoughts are about how to, I love that you're talking about acknowledging people's humanness, offering to co-regulate with people, but also, not reinforce bad behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of this happens within the context of boundaries, right? And so it's not always appropriate to be asking a particular person to be co-regulating with you especially if that person is, has just been harmed by you or is in a state of nervous system distress themselves that is not in a place where they are willing or able to do that work with you. And that's fine. Like, I don't want to turn this around and make this into like a new way of like scolding and shaming each other. Like, you must be co-regulating with everyone all the time. It's not like a must. And even in like a close, intimate relationship, not your partner or your friend is not always going to be available to do that. And they might be so triggered in their own nervous system that they can't do that right now, or they might simply just not be in the place for it, right? So I think it's like a really good idea to have a lot of tools in your toolbox. And so some of the work that I do with people around trauma-informed polyamory is to try to help people to build those tools. And that can range from the stuff I was talking about earlier, that is like totally like self-regulation stuff. It can also be things like co-regulating with a pet. Like, people love their dogs. It can be like co-regulating in nature and your relationship with the trees or the water. It can be co-regulating with a friend who isn't the person who is like super triggered by what you just did,
Yeah. Helpful.
So I think it's like there's many, many options, and it doesn't have to be like, you must co-regulate with me right now. Like, not everybody's going to be available for that all the time. And that's fine. But even if a person has, acted in a way that isn't great, I still really believe that they do deserve co-regulation, and they kind of need that. So it's like, how are we going to meet those people's needs? And sometimes that can be really tricky, especially when there's traumatized people who are acting out in ways that are really harmful. And so I do think that as communities, we really do need to figure out how to offer co-regulation in boundaried ways that are still respectful of our own nervous systems and our own boundaries, while still acknowledging that like human beings need other people and can't heal in isolation.
Yeah. I mean, I think the nuance around support and community, right? Of like, oh, this is what support and community means on a nervous system level, is what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Curious about, this question's coming from a listener to Bespoken Bones who asks what you would suggest as a radical response to exhaustion. And they wrote that when a long road of healing requires new tools and sudden breakthroughs, but the stamina feels worn down through years of careful, steady, incremental work. And they say that the sensation is one of needing to sprint in a completely new direction on the heels of a marathon not yet over. So, well, yeah, just what do you suggest as a radical response to exhaustion?
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is to normalize how exhausting complex trauma and like long-term trauma work can be. And I frequently say to my therapist, like in full exasperation, like, I literally can't anymore. Like, I cannot with this, like, I'm over it. I'm sick of this. I want this to be done. And I really relate to that, of like having come so far in one aspect of trauma only to suddenly realize like there's this whole other thing that now needs to be addressed. I think that that's super common and normal. And so I think that really like offering compassion to that and normalizing that experience is a really important piece. I don't think that there's an easy answer for it, unfortunately. I would say, though, that I don't think it's ever a sprint. I think that there can be this sense of urgency, especially when we have spent so many years trying to get to a place where we feel better and more is coming up. It can be extremely exhausting. But I try to stay with the process itself, and I try to have gratitude for the things that have shifted and changed. And like when I'm triggered, it's really hard for me to see that anything has shifted and changed. So sometimes I really need to like talk to other people and get them to remind me what has changed, or write lists and like look at how far I have come, even if I still feel really stuck in certain areas. And to just really allow the process to unfold. And again, like it came up in this conversation, but like moving away from a linear model to a more like circular model that kind of allows things to unfold and then kind of go back underground and unfold again. It's more realistic to like what my actual experience of trauma recovery has been than this sort of like all progress moving in a straight line, heading towards the finish line kind of thing.
Super helpful, Clementine. I was reminded of when I was in a moment of really deep trauma processing work a few years ago. For Valentine's Day, my partner just spontaneously made me a list of all the ways that they can see that healing is happening for me, or like how they know that I'm worthy of love, and it was so, I just read it again recently because like in those moments, it's really hard. It's like, you're like tired and you've been working and working and working and it doesn't seem like there's any end in sight. And now you have to go in this other direction. And yeah, I like that of like kind of reflecting and bringing in gratitude of like, oh, here's all the ways that the healing has happened, right? Not to see like kind of like, I guess it's like a glass half full mentality, right? Of like, oh yeah, this has happened. And then the other thing I think about in terms of this question is like, well, what else are you going to do? Like, there's so, we have these lifetimes. And I think when I think about it in the transgenerational context, we're not just healing for ourselves, as we talked about earlier, right? And we're not just healing stuff that's happened to us in these lifetimes. And it's okay if I'm thinking of one person who I interviewed in my dissertation process. She talked about 1 degree of healing per generation, right? That that things get better with time. That it's not actually all on you, right? That you do as much as you can, and then you can also relax and know that future generations will pick up, right? Yeah. I want to just check in with you about new projects that you're working on. I know that you're maybe doing some zine series. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm always doing 10 million things. Fucking Magick is a zine series. So there's been 12 issues and I'm continuing that. So there's always a new issue coming out every 3 months of Fucking Magick. That's my ongoing series. I also just released my Trauma-Informed Polyamory workshop online. So prior to this, it was always something that I did. I traveled and did it in person, but the sort of need for that workshop and how much interest there was like way bigger than my capacity to actually go places. So I've actually created a video that people can download and access my workshop that way. So that is a big project that I just got out within the last month or so.
That's great. And where can folks get your zines?
So you can order them on my website, which is clementinemorrigan.com. And yeah, my workshop is for sale there. All my zines and my books are all for sale on my website. I also have a Patreon, which is just patreon.com/Clementine Morrigan. And I update that about twice a month with new writing. And you can also get most of my zines as PDFs on my Patreon.
Oh, that's awesome. That is fantastic. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being such a force of fabulosity in the world and like really rocking it with just like the fierceness and the fearlessness and the bringing itness of it's almost just like, yeah, like the demanding of desire and desirability and wellness for yourself. I'm always thinking about like role models. Like, who do I want to have as my erotic role models? Who do I want to have as my wellness role models? Like, right? Like putting a spotlight on folks who are maybe a step further ahead of us on the path. And I just think that it's like really important what I am getting from your work is just like a real sense of generosity, that like you're deeply in your process, you're in your healing work. And it's also not just you on your own. You're taking your communities along with you and inviting them into that journey. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I guess just to like kind of close, like one thing that in relationship to ancestry is like, we trace ancestry so often through blood. And for trauma survivors, especially people who experience trauma in our family, that can be a really loaded thing. And I know that queer people had traced other lineages, like chosen lineages. And for me, an important lineage is the lineage of survivors. And like other survivors are so totally my people, tracing back through time and into the future. And the work that I do is so to help other trauma survivors grapple with this stuff, because I really do feel that other survivors are my family in a way that I didn't have from my biological family.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you, Clementine. And I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I've been speaking with Clementine Morrigan, and obviously check out their website at clementinemorrigan.com. And I also want to draw your attention to a couple of things. If you find Bespoken Bones helpful, we welcome your support on Patreon. You can have access to ask questions to our upcoming guests. We also have a new YouTube channel where you can like it and subscribe to it. And we're revamping our Instagram account. And so if you have feedback or ideas, check us out on Instagram at Bespoken Bones. And I'm Pavini Moray. This is Bespoken Bones Podcast, and we will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.